The pen shook in Eleanor Hart's hand as the solicitor slid the final paper across the polished table. One signature. That was all it would take to end 4 years of marriage to Julian Ashford, Duke of Renfield. She could feel his eyes on her from across the room, cold and unreadable. The same eyes that once looked at her like she was the only warm thing in a house full of stone. She did not look up. If she looked up, she might lose her courage, and she needed every last drop of it to walk out of that room and never come back. "Take your time, Your Grace," the solicitor murmured, though he was speaking to her, not to Julian. Everyone in this house still called her that, even though by evening she would be nothing to this family at all. Eleanor pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name. Eleanor Hart. Not Ashford. Never again Ashford. The scratch of the pen was the loudest sound in the room. Julian did not move from his place by the window. He had not said a single word since she arrived, not a greeting, not a protest, not even her name. His silence had always been the thing that hurt more than any argument could. She stood, smoothed the front of her gray traveling dress, and reached for her gloves. Her hand trembled again, but this time it was not from fear. It was from the secret pressed so tightly against her ribs that she thought it might crack her open right there in front of him. She was carrying his child. No one knew. Not the solicitor, not the servants, not even her own sister. Eleanor had learned only 3 weeks ago, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the sickness in her stomach would not let her sleep. She had sat on the edge of her bed in the room she no longer shared with her husband, and pressed both hands to her middle, and she had wept, not from joy, but from the terrible weight of what she now had to decide. She could have used it. She could have walked into his study and told him, and he would have stopped the papers instantly. A duke did not let his heir be born outside his own walls. He would have kept her, not because he loved her, but because duty demanded it. And Eleanor had spent 4 years being kept out of duty. She would rather raise her child alone in a cottage with a leaking roof than spend 1 more year in a marriage built on obligation. So she said nothing. "Is that all?" she asked the solicitor, her voice steadier than she felt. "That is all, my lady. The settlement has been arranged as discussed. You will receive the sum quarterly through my office, so that your address need not be known to the family." Eleanor nodded. She had insisted on that condition herself. Whatever happened next, whatever life she built, it would be far from Renfield, far from the cold halls and the colder aunt who ran them, and far from the man standing by the window who had once promised to love her and instead had buried himself in grief the moment his mother died, leaving no room for a wife who only wanted to help him carry it. She walked toward the door. Her hand was on the handle when his voice finally broke the silence. "Eleanor." She stopped. She did not turn around. If she turned around now, she would see his face, and she was afraid of what she might do if she saw even a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with beneath all that ice. "You do not have to do this," Julian said. His voice was low, rough, as if the words cost him something to say. For one terrible moment, hope rose in her chest, like a bird startled into flight. "Say more," she thought. "Say you were wrong. Say you noticed I was gone before I was already gone." But he said nothing else. The silence stretched, and the bird in her chest fell back down to earth. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." She opened the door and stepped out into the corridor before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. The walk to the front hall felt longer than it ever had before. Portraits of Ashford dukes and duchesses lined the walls. Generations of cold, proper faces staring down at her, as if they already knew she did not belong among them. She had felt that way from the very first day she arrived at Renfield, a merchant's daughter married into a family that valued bloodlines above everything else. Julian's aunt, Margaret Fenwick, had made certain Eleanor never forgot her place. It was Margaret who stood waiting at the bottom of the grand staircase now, arms folded, a thin smile on her lips that did not reach her eyes. "Leaving so soon?" Margaret asked, as though Eleanor were a guest departing after tea rather than a wife leaving her husband's house forever. "I would think you'd be pleased," Eleanor said. "You have wanted me gone since the day I arrived." "I only ever wanted what was best for this family," Margaret said. "You were never suited to it, my dear. Some women simply are not built for this kind of life." Eleanor could have said many things in that moment. She could have told Margaret exactly what she thought of a woman who spent 4 years whispering poison into her nephew's ear, who made certain every letter Eleanor tried to send him during his darkest grief was mysteriously lost, who filled his head with doubts about a wife who had done nothing but love him. She could have told her that the secret she carried would one day walk through these very doors again, and there would be nothing Margaret could do to stop it. But she said none of it. She simply looked at the older woman, straightened her spine, and walked past her toward the waiting carriage. Outside, the autumn air was sharp and clean, a welcome change from the suffocating warmth of the house behind her. Her single trunk had already been loaded. She had packed lightly on purpose. She did not want to carry anything from that life into the next one. Nothing, except the small ring her mother had given her before she died, and the child growing quietly beneath her heart. As the carriage pulled away, Eleanor allowed herself one last look at Renfield. The great stone house rose against the gray sky, like something out of a story, beautiful and cold in equal measure. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure at the window of Julian's study, watching her go. She could not be certain it was him. She told herself it did not matter either way. She turned her face forward and did not look back again. The journey to the small town of Ashbrook took most of the day. Eleanor had chosen it carefully, a quiet place 2 counties away from Renfield, far enough that no one would recognize the name Ashford should it ever slip from her lips, close enough that the money from her settlement would stretch to give her and her child a decent, simple life. She had written ahead to secure a small cottage from a widow named Agnes Pratt, describing herself only as a young widow seeking peace and quiet. It was not entirely a lie. In every way that mattered, the marriage was dead, even if the man himself still breathed. By the time the carriage rolled into Ashbrook, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and rose. Eleanor stepped down onto the cobblestone street outside a small, ivy-covered cottage, her legs stiff from the long ride, her heart pounding with a mixture of grief and something she had not expected to feel at all. Relief. For the first time in 4 years, she was no longer waiting for a man to love her. She was no longer holding her breath in empty rooms, hoping for a kind word that never came. Whatever came next, whatever hardships waited for her in this new life, they would be hers alone to face, and she would face them with a strength she did not know she had until this very moment. Agnes Pratt met her at the gate, a stout, kind-faced woman with flour still dusting her apron. "You must be Mrs. Hart," she said warmly, using the name Eleanor had given in her letters. Come in, you look chilled through. I've got the kettle on." Eleanor managed a small smile, the first genuine one in weeks. "Thank you," she said. "I think I would like that very much." Inside, the cottage was small but warm, with a low fire already crackling in the hearth and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Agnes led her to a simple bedroom at the top of the narrow stairs, its window overlooking a modest garden gone wild with the last flowers of the season. "It isn't much," Agnes said, setting Eleanor's trunk down at the foot of the bed. "But it's quiet, and quiet is a fine thing after a hard road." "It's lovely," Eleanor said, and meant it. There was no grandeur here, no marble floors or portraits watching her every move, only plain wooden furniture and a bed with a patchwork quilt that looked as though it had been stitched with great care. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the space around her did not feel like it belonged to someone else. She sat on the edge of the bed once Agnes had gone back downstairs to fetch the promised tea, and pressed both hands against her stomach, still barely showing beneath her traveling dress. "It's just us now," she whispered into the quiet room. "But I promise you, you will never doubt that you are wanted. Not for one single day of your life." Outside, a cart rattled past on the cobblestones, and somewhere in the distance a church bell rang out the hour, unhurried and steady, marking the start of a life Eleanor had chosen entirely for herself. She thought of Renfield, of the cold stone halls and the portraits of ancestors who had never once smiled down at her, and she felt the tightness in her chest begin, slowly, to loosen. She thought too of Julian, of the low, rough sound of her name on his lips just before she left the room. She had spent 4 years memorizing every shade of his silence, learning to read grief in the set of his shoulders, and regret in the way he sometimes reached for her hand, and then let it fall before touching her. She did not know, sitting in that small borrowed room with her whole future ahead of her and unknown, whether he would ever come looking. She only knew that if he did, he would have to prove himself worthy of what he had so carelessly let go. Agnes returned a few minutes later carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups and a plate of warm bread, and the 2 women sat together by the window as the last light faded from the sky, talking of small and simple things, the price of wool in the market, the best baker in town, nothing at all that touched the ache still lodged deep in Eleanor's chest. It was, in its own quiet way, exactly what she needed. With one hand resting lightly on her middle, Eleanor made herself a silent promise. Whatever the future held, whatever her child would one day ask about their father, she would raise them with love enough for 2 parents. She would not let the cold walls of Renfield or the cruelty of a bitter aunt touch this new life she was building. She did not know then how soon that promise would be tested, nor how far a desperate man's regret could reach once it finally caught up with him. She only knew, standing in the doorway of her small new home as the last light of day faded behind her, that she had finally begun to breathe again. Behind her, miles away, Julian Ashford remained at the window of his study long after the carriage had disappeared from view, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, and for the first time since his mother's death, allowed himself to feel the full and crushing weight of everything he had lost. The knock on the cottage door came harder than it needed to, 3 sharp raps that made Eleanor's heart jump into her throat. It was too early for visitors, and Ashbrook was not the kind of town where strangers knocked without reason. She set down the needle and thread in her lap, one hand instinctively moving to shield the small, round curve of her stomach, and rose slowly from her chair. 6 months had passed since she left Renfield, 6 months of building a life so quiet and so far from her old one that she sometimes forgot, for whole stretches of an afternoon, that she had ever been a duchess at all. She crossed the small front room and opened the door only a crack. It was not Julian, it was not anyone from Renfield at all. A young man stood on the step, hat in hand, out of breath from what looked like a hurried walk across town. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said. "Dr. Whitmore sent me. Said to fetch you straight away. There's been an accident down at the mill. A girl's hurt bad, and he needs another pair of steady hands." Eleanor's shoulders sank with relief before the meaning of his words fully settled. "Of course," she said, already reaching for her shawl. "Tell him I'm coming." In the months since arriving in Ashbrook, Eleanor had found unexpected purpose helping Dr. Charles Whitmore, the town's only physician, a widower in his 50s with gentle hands and a habit of talking to his patients as though they were old friends rather than strangers in pain. She had gone to him first for her own care, given her condition, and had ended up returning again and again, first to bring him supplies, then to assist him with small tasks, and eventually to sit at his side during difficult cases, her steady presence proving more useful than either of them had expected. She hurried through the streets of Ashbrook, her cloak pulled tight against the autumn wind, and arrived at Whitmore's small surgery to find him bent over a young mill worker whose arm had been badly caught in a piece of machinery. The girl was pale and shaking, tears streaking down a face still smudged with flour dust. "Hold her hand," Whitmore said without looking up, already reaching for his instruments. "Talk to her. Keep her calm while I work." Eleanor knelt beside the narrow cot and took the girl's uninjured hand in both of hers. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Nora," the girl gasped through her tears. "Nora Fenn." "Well, Nora Fenn, you are going to be just fine," Eleanor said, keeping her voice low and steady even as her heart ached at the girl's obvious pain. "Dr. Whitmore is the finest physician in 3 counties, and I have never once seen him lose a patient to something as small as a stubborn old machine." It was not entirely true, but it made Nora laugh through her tears, just for a moment, and that moment of distraction was enough for Whitmore to do what needed doing. By the time it was over, Nora's arm was set and bound, her tears had dried, and the color had begun to return to her cheeks. "You have a gift for that," Whitmore said afterward, washing his hands in a basin while Eleanor helped Nora into a chair to rest before her family arrived. "Calming, folks. Not everyone can do it. Most people either fuss too much or say nothing useful at all." "I had a great deal of practice," Eleanor said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, calming a household that was often on the edge of some quiet storm or another. Whitmore glanced at her, curious but too polite to press. He had never asked about her past, never questioned why a well-spoken young woman with a merchant's careful accent and a lady's fine manners had arrived in Ashbrook alone and pregnant, claiming widowhood with a story that never quite added up in the details. He had simply accepted her as she presented herself, and for that quiet kindness, Eleanor was more grateful than she could ever say. "You'll make a fine mother," he said instead, drying his hands. "That child is fortunate." Eleanor smiled, though something in her chest tightened at the words. She often wondered, in the quiet hours before sleep, what kind of mother she would truly be, alone, without a husband, without the support of any family beyond the modest income sent quarterly through a solicitor's office. But she had made her choice, and she did not regret it, not even on the hardest days. She returned to the cottage as the sun began to set, tired but strangely content, and found Agnes waiting with a pot of stew already simmering over the fire. "Dr. Whitmore's boy came looking for you again," Agnes said, ladling stew into a bowl and setting it before Eleanor at the small kitchen table. "That's the 3rd time this month. You ought to let him pay you properly for your help, instead of running yourself ragged for nothing but his thanks." "I don't mind it," Eleanor said. "It gives me something to do, something that matters." Agnes studied her for a long moment, the way she sometimes did when she suspected there was more to Eleanor's story than she had been told. "You're further along than you let on, aren't you?" she said finally, nodding toward the gentle curve beneath Eleanor's apron. "That babe will be here before the first snow, unless I miss my guess." Eleanor's hand moved to her stomach, and for the first time since arriving in Ashbrook, she felt the full weight of how close it truly was. "I think you might be right," she admitted quietly. "And the father," Agnes said, her voice gentler now. "You know?" The question hung in the warm kitchen air between them. Eleanor had never told Agnes the truth, not the real truth. Only the same careful story she had told everyone in Ashbrook, of a young widow whose husband had died before his child was born. It was easier that way, safer. But something about the older woman's steady, kind gaze made Eleanor want, just once, to speak an honest word. "He does not know," Eleanor said, "and it is better that way, for now." Agnes did not push further, only reached across the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand once, briefly, before returning to her own bowl of stew. "Well," she said, "whoever he was, and whatever happened between you, that child in there is lucky to have a mother brave enough to build a whole new life, rather than stay somewhere she wasn't wanted. That takes more courage than most folks ever find in a lifetime." Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and blinked them away quickly, not trusting herself to speak. She finished her stew in comfortable silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of church bells marking the evening hour, and allowed herself, just for that moment, to feel entirely at peace. That peace did not last through the night. She woke sometime past midnight to a deep, pulling ache low in her back, and at first she told herself it was nothing, only the strain of a long day spent on her feet at Nora Fenn's bedside. She turned onto her side, tried to settle back into sleep, and instead felt the ache sharpen into something unmistakable, a tightening that gripped her entire middle and left her breathless. It was too soon. Agnes had said before the first snow, and the first snow was still weeks away by every reasonable guess. But the ache came again, harder this time, and Eleanor understood, with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, that her child had decided on its own timing, and had no intention of waiting for anyone's permission. She managed to call out, her voice cracking with effort, and within minutes Agnes was at her bedside, already pulling on her shawl and shouting for the boy who slept in the small room above the stable to run for Dr. Whitmore. The hours that followed blurred together into a haze of pain and effort and Agnes's steady voice murmuring encouragement, and somewhere beneath it all, the memory of Julian's face rose unbidden in Eleanor's mind, not the cold, distant man who had let her walk away without a fight, but the younger version of him she had fallen in love with, the one who used to press his hand against her stomach in the early days of their marriage, and speak softly of the children they might someday have. She pushed the memory away. This child was hers. Whatever happened next, whatever the future held, this child belonged to her alone, and she would love them enough to make up for the father who did not even know they existed. When Dr. Whitmore arrived, breathless from the cold night air, he took one look at Eleanor and immediately set to work, calm and sure despite the earliness of the hour. "You're doing well," he told her, his voice steady even as the pains came harder and closer together. "Better than well, just a little longer now." Eleanor gripped Agnes's hand so tightly she feared she might break it, and somewhere in the depths of the pain, she found a strength she had not known she possessed, the same strength that had carried her out of Renfield 6 months earlier, the same strength that had built this entire quiet life, from nothing but grit and a single trunk of belongings. Just before dawn, as the first pale light began to creep through the small bedroom window, Eleanor heard a thin, furious cry fill the room, and Dr. Whitmore's tired but delighted voice announcing, "A son, a fine, healthy son." They placed the baby in her arms, still warm and wrinkled and impossibly small, and Eleanor looked down into a tiny face and felt her entire world narrow to that single moment. He had a full head of dark hair, and when his eyes finally opened, just for a moment before drifting closed again in exhausted sleep, she saw a shade of blue-gray so familiar it stole the breath from her lungs. Julian's eyes. Unmistakably, undeniably Julian's eyes, staring back at her from the face of their son. "What will you name him?" Agnes asked softly, still holding Eleanor's hand, tears of her own shining in the early morning light. Eleanor looked down at her son, at the small, fierce set of his jaw, already so much like his father's, and felt something settle deep inside her, a quiet certainty that this child would grow into someone strong, someone good, someone worthy of every sacrifice she had made to bring him safely into the world. "Henry," she whispered. "His name is Henry." The weeks that followed passed in a warm, exhausted blur. Eleanor learned the rhythms of motherhood the way she had learned everything else in Ashbrook, through trial, patience, and the steady kindness of the women around her. Agnes taught her how to soothe Henry's midnight crying with a particular sway and hum, how to tell a hungry cry from a tired one, how to bundle him against the cold when she carried him to the market. Nora Fenn, her arm fully healed and her gratitude undimmed, took to visiting most afternoons, cradling Henry in her good arm, and declaring him the handsomest baby in all of Ashbrook, a claim Eleanor never once bothered to dispute. Dr. Whitmore called often as well, checking on mother and child with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to every patient, and it was during one of these visits, as Henry slept soundly in a basket by the fire, that he said something which lodged itself in Eleanor's mind and refused to leave. "There was a man in town yesterday," Whitmore said, accepting the cup of tea Eleanor offered, asking after new arrivals from the past year. "A woman traveling alone," he said, well-dressed, kept to herself. He studied her over the rim of his cup. "I told him Ashbrook was full of women who kept to themselves. Didn't seem to satisfy him much." Eleanor's heart had gone very still. "Did he give a name?" "Croft," he said, "a solicitor's clerk, by his manner of speaking, though he wore no livery and carried no papers I could see." Whitmore set down his cup, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm not one to pry into a woman's business, Mrs. Hart, but if there's someone you'd rather not be found by, you might tell Agnes to keep her ears open at the market. News travels faster through gossip than through any solicitor's letter." Eleanor thanked him, her voice steadier than her racing pulse, and after he left she stood a long while at the window, watching the empty street outside, Henry's small weight solid and reassuring against her shoulder. Croft. She did not know the name, but a solicitor's clerk asking after a woman traveling alone could mean only one thing. Someone, somewhere, had begun to look for her. She told herself it might be nothing. Distant relations settling some forgotten matter, a mistaken inquiry meant for another woman entirely. But that night, after Agnes had gone to bed and the cottage had fallen silent, Eleanor sat by the dying fire with Henry sleeping against her chest, and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to truly consider what might happen if Julian ever learned the truth. Would he come himself, or send men to fetch the child away and leave her behind, an inconvenience once her usefulness was spent? Would his Aunt Margaret finally have the ammunition she needed to erase Eleanor from the family's history entirely, painting her as some scheming woman who had run off with a duke's heir rather than a wife who had simply asked for honesty and received silence instead? The possibilities circled in her mind like crows, dark and persistent, and she held her son a little tighter, pressing a kiss to the soft crown of his head. "Whatever comes," she whispered into the quiet room, "I will not let them take you from me. Not without a fight they will remember for the rest of their lives." Outside the small cottage window, the first light of true morning eventually broke over Ashbrook, gentle and golden, as if the whole world had paused to welcome the newest and smallest resident of the quiet little town. A boy who did not yet know he had been born the secret heir to a dukedom, and a mother who was already determined to raise him far from the cold walls and colder hearts that might one day come looking for him, even as the first quiet whispers of that very search had already begun to stir, far closer than she yet realized. The glass shattered against the study wall before Julian Ashford even realized he had thrown it. Wine bled down the pale stone in a dark red streak, and for a long moment he simply stared at it, breathing hard, his hand still curled into the shape it had held around the goblet's stem. "You will pay for that carpet, I imagine," his aunt said from the doorway, her tone as dry and unbothered as if she were commenting on the weather. "Though I suppose a duke can afford a great many ruined carpets. Get out, Margaret. This is still my house, as much as it is yours, nephew. My brother built it, and I have every right to walk its halls." Margaret Fenwick stepped further into the room anyway, her dark skirts whispering against the floor, her expression composed into the same mask of patient concern she always wore when she wished to appear blameless. "I only came to see what all the shouting was about. The servants are beginning to talk." "Let them talk." Julian turned away from her, bracing both hands against the windowsill, staring out at the gray gardens beyond the glass. 7 months. 7 months since Eleanor had walked out of this house, and every single day since had felt like watching the walls close in a little further. I have had another letter from Croft returned unanswered. Whatever inquiries he has made in the past 3 months, they have led nowhere. "Perhaps," Margaret said carefully, "because there is nothing to find. Perhaps she has simply gone, Julian, as she made quite clear she wished to. A woman does not sign divorce papers and then leave a trail of breadcrumbs for a husband who never once fought to keep her." The words landed exactly where she intended them to, in the softest, most tender part of his guilt, and Julian's jaw tightened. "I know precisely how little I fought for her," he said. "I do not need you to remind me of it." He had spent the months since Eleanor's departure in a strange, suspended state, moving through the motions of managing the estate, attending to tenants and accounts and the endless correspondence that came with his title, all while some essential part of him remained frozen in that solicitor's office, watching her sign her name and walk out of the room without once looking back. He had told himself, in the beginning, that it was for the best, that a marriage built on his own inability to grieve properly, to let anyone close enough to help him carry the weight of his mother's death, had been doomed from the start, and that Eleanor deserved better than a husband who flinched from her comfort, as though it might break him further. But the weeks had turned to months, and the anger he had used to justify his silence had slowly burned away, leaving only the truth underneath it, plain and unbearable. He had not stopped loving her. He had simply stopped believing he deserved to. "You are wasting your grief on a woman who was never suited to this family," Margaret said, moving to pour herself a small glass of the wine that remained unbroken on the sideboard. "I told your mother as much before she died. A merchant's daughter, however pretty, however clever, does not understand what it means to carry the Ashford name. She proved that herself, the moment she chose to walk away, rather than fight for her place here." Julian turned sharply. "She did not walk away, Margaret. I let her go. There is a considerable difference, and you know it well, because you spent 4 years ensuring the distance between us grew wider every single day." Something flickered across his aunt's face, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it, had he not known her for the whole of his life and learned to read even her smallest tells. "I do not know what you mean," she said. "Do you not?" Julian crossed the room slowly, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret Fenwick took a small step backward. "I have been going through my mother's old correspondence this past week. There were letters, Margaret, letters from Eleanor to me, during those first difficult months after Mother's death, letters I never received, though the household ledgers show they arrived, and were logged by the housekeeper, letters that somehow never made their way to my desk." "Servants misplace things," Margaret said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier composure. "It happens more often than you would credit. 6 letters, over the course of 2 months, all misplaced by the very same servant who reports directly to you." Julian's voice had gone very quiet, which was, as anyone who knew him well understood, far more dangerous than shouting. "What did they say, Margaret? What did my wife write to me that you decided I did not need to read?" Margaret set down her glass with a hand that was not quite steady. "I did what I believed was necessary for this family. You decided, on my behalf, what I was and was not permitted to know about my own marriage. She was going to leave regardless, Julian. Women like her always do, once the shine wears off a title, and they realize what a marriage to this family actually requires. I simply spared you the trouble of false hope." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment Julian said nothing at all, staring at his aunt, as though seeing her clearly for the very first time in his life. "Get out of this house," he said finally, his voice low and absolutely without mercy. "Not out of this room, Margaret. Out of Renfield entirely. You have 3 days to make whatever arrangements you require, and then I do not wish to see your face within these walls again." "You cannot possibly mean that." "I have never meant anything more clearly in my life." Margaret's composure finally cracked, her face flushing with a fury she had kept carefully hidden for years. "You will regret this. Whatever foolishness you intend, chasing after a woman who wanted nothing more to do with you, you will come to regret casting aside the only family who ever truly understood what it means to carry this name." "I have regretted a great many things this past year," Julian said quietly. "Losing my wife, chief among them. Losing you, Margaret, will not trouble me nearly so much." She left the room without another word, her footsteps sharp and furious against the stone floor, and Julian remained standing alone amid the ruin of the shattered glass and the wine still drying dark against the wall, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that almost resembled clarity. He rang for his valet and asked that Barnaby Croft be summoned to Renfield at the earliest possible hour, and then he sat at his desk and began, methodically, to go through every scrap of correspondence his aunt had touched in the past 4 years, searching for whatever else she might have hidden from him. It took the better part of 2 days, working through the night by candlelight when sleep refused to come, but eventually he found it, tucked into the back of an old ledger where it had clearly been placed to be forgotten. A letter in Eleanor's careful hand, dated only weeks before her departure, the ink slightly smudged in places as though the writer's hand had trembled while composing it. "Julian," it began, and his chest tightened simply at the sight of his own name in her handwriting. I do not know if you will ever read this, but I find I must write it regardless, if only to have said the words somewhere, even if only to paper. I have tried, these past years, to reach you through your grief, and I have failed, not for lack of trying, but because I do not think you have ever truly let me close enough to succeed. I do not blame you for your sorrow. I only wish you had trusted me enough to share it, rather than shutting me out as though I were another burden to carry, rather than a partner to help carry it with you. I love you still. I think I will love you for a long while yet, whatever becomes of us. But I cannot continue living in a house where my husband looks through me rather than at me, where every attempt at closeness is met with silence, where I have begun to forget what it felt like to be truly seen by anyone at all. If something does not change soon, I fear I will have no choice but to leave, not because I have stopped loving you, but because loving you like this, from such a distance, is slowly breaking something in me that I do not think can be mended. Please, Julian, let me in, before it is too late for both of us. The letter was unsigned, as though she had never quite finished it, or perhaps had simply run out of courage to send it through any channel but the housekeeper's careful hand, trusting that it would reach him. It had not. Whether by his aunt's direct order, or simply by the housekeeper's misguided loyalty, the letter had vanished into a ledger instead, and Julian had spent the following weeks growing colder and more distant, never knowing that his wife had reached for him one final time and found, instead of his hand, only silence. He sat with the letter for a long while, the candle burning low beside him, and felt something in his chest crack open entirely, all the careful walls he had built since his mother's death, finally giving way beneath the weight of what he had lost through his own inability to grieve honestly, and his aunt's quiet, calculated cruelty. When Barnaby Croft arrived the following afternoon, he found the Duke of Renfield looking as though he had aged 5 years in the span of a week. Dark shadows beneath his eyes, his usually immaculate appearance rumpled from lack of sleep. "Your Grace," Croft began carefully, "my inquiries have, I am afraid, produced little of substance. Mrs. Hart, as she now calls herself, appears to have left no clear trail. She withdrew her settlement each quarter through the London office, as arranged, but the address on file leads only to a forwarding service that declines to disclose further information." "Then find whoever operates that forwarding service," Julian said, "and offer whatever sum is required to loosen their discretion. Your Grace, if I may ask, what precisely has changed? You instructed me some months ago to make only quiet, respectful inquiries, nothing that might trouble her peace." Julian was quiet for a long moment, the letter still resting on the desk before him, its edges soft from repeated handling. "I have learned," he said finally, "that my wife wrote to me before she left, a letter asking me to let her in, to trust her enough to share my grief, rather than shut her out of it. I never received it. My aunt saw to that, along with 5 others before it." His voice roughened. "I owe her an answer to that letter, Croft, 7 months late though it may be. I intend to deliver it in person, whatever it costs, and however long it takes to find her." Croft studied his employer for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his normally impassive features. "I will redouble my efforts, Your Grace, discreetly, but without delay. Thank you." Julian rose from his desk and moved once more to the window, looking out over the gray gardens where autumn had begun to strip the last leaves from the trees. Somewhere beyond those gardens, beyond the boundaries of the estate and the county and every mile of England between them, Eleanor was living a life he knew nothing about, carrying whatever burdens had come from his own failures, and he found himself praying, for the first time in years, that it was not too late to make it right. He did not yet know about Henry. He did not know that the woman he had failed so completely was, at that very moment, teaching their infant son to grip her finger with a tiny, determined hand, or that every day that passed without his knowledge was a day he could never reclaim. He knew only that he had wronged her, deeply and irreparably by his own aunt's design and his own cowardice in the face of grief, and that he intended to spend whatever time it took to find her and beg, if necessary, for the chance to be the man she had once believed him capable of becoming. 3 days later, Margaret Fenwick departed Renfield in a hired carriage, her belongings packed hastily into trunks that had once traveled with far more ceremony, and Julian watched her go from the same window where he had once watched Eleanor's carriage disappear down the long drive. This time he felt no regret at all, only a grim and steady resolve settling into place where his grief had lived for far too long. In the weeks that followed, Julian threw himself into the search with an intensity that surprised even his own household staff. Men and women who had grown accustomed to a master who moved through his days like a ghost haunting his own home. He rode out with Croft to London twice, sitting in cramped offices while clerks shuffled through ledgers, following one false lead after another, each disappointment sharpening his determination rather than dulling it. It was on a cold morning in late November, nearly a month after Margaret's departure, that Croft finally arrived at Renfield with something more than another dead end. He found Julian in the stables of all places, currying his horse himself rather than leaving the task to a groom, a habit he had taken up in recent weeks whenever restlessness threatened to overwhelm him. "Your Grace," Croft said, slightly out of breath from his ride, "I believe we have found something at last." Julian set down the brush at once. "Tell me." "The forwarding service in London, the one handling Mrs. Hart's quarterly settlement. I could not persuade the head clerk to disclose the address directly, discretion being their entire business, but I did learn something of value. The clerk let slip, quite by accident, that the letters are forwarded onward to a solicitor's office in a market town some 2 counties north. A small practice, nothing grand, but it services a number of families in that district." "Which town?" "Ashbrook, Your Grace. A quiet place, known mostly for its wool trade and little else." Julian felt something shift in his chest, a tightening that was equal parts hope and fear. Ashbrook. He turned the name over in his mind, searching for any memory of it, any reason Eleanor might have chosen such a place, and found none. That, he decided, was precisely why she had chosen it. Nowhere he would think to look first. "I want to leave within the hour," he said. "Your Grace, if I may caution you, we do not yet know for certain that she remains there. The letters are forwarded to a solicitor's office, but that does not confirm her residence in the town itself. It may simply be where she instructed her correspondence to be received. Then we will begin there and search further if we must." Julian was already calling for his horse to be saddled properly, his earlier restlessness transformed entirely into purpose. "I have spent 7 months waiting for scraps of information to fall into my lap, Croft. I will not spend another week doing the same when I finally have a direction worth pursuing." Before he left, he rode out alone to the small churchyard on the eastern edge of the estate, where his mother lay buried beneath a modest stone she herself had chosen, refusing anything grander despite her position. He had not visited in months, unable to face the grief that still lived there, sharp and unresolved, but that morning he knelt beside the stone and allowed himself, finally, to speak the words he had carried silently for so long. "I let her go because I did not know how to grieve you, and love her at the same time," he said quietly, the cold air fogging with each word. "I thought protecting myself meant shutting everyone out, even her, especially her. I was wrong. I think you would tell me I was wrong, if you could. I think you liked her far more than you ever let Margaret believe." He pressed his palm flat against the cold stone. "I am going to find her, Mother. And if she will have me, I intend to spend whatever years I have left proving I learned my lesson, however late it came." He rose, brushed the frost from his knees, and walked back to where his horse waited, patient and steady in the pale winter light. Whatever waited for him in Ashbrook, whatever answer Eleanor might give him after everything he had failed to do, he intended to face it honestly, without his aunt's poison or his own grief standing between them any longer. He had let one woman walk away from him through silence and neglect. He would not make that same mistake twice, not if there remained even the smallest chance of finding her again. The carriage wheel struck a rut in the road hard enough to jolt Julian from the half-sleep he had fallen into, and he sat forward at once, pulling back the curtain to look out at unfamiliar streets. Ashbrook. 2 days of hard travel had brought him here at last, cold and tired and running on nothing but coffee and a determination that had not wavered once since leaving Renfield. "We should find lodging first, Your Grace," Croft said from the opposite seat, his own eyes heavy with fatigue. "It is nearly dusk, and making inquiries at this hour will only draw unwanted attention." "An hour," Julian said. "Give me 1 hour to walk the town before we settle anywhere. I have waited 7 months. I do not think I can bear to sit idle in some inn parlor a moment longer than necessary." Croft, wisely, did not argue. The carriage stopped near the town square, and Julian stepped down into the cold evening air, pulling his coat tighter as he took in his surroundings. Ashbrook was exactly the sort of place he might have expected Eleanor to choose, quiet and unremarkable. The kind of town that would never draw the attention of anyone searching for a duchess. Modest shops lined the cobblestone street, their windows already glowing with lamplight against the gathering dusk, and somewhere nearby the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery preparing for the following morning's trade. He walked without any clear direction, simply letting his feet carry him along the main street, past a small church, past a shuttered market stall, past a physician's surgery with a lamp still burning in the window despite the late hour. He told himself he was only getting his bearings, that any true search would have to wait until morning, when Croft could begin proper inquiries at the local solicitor's office without raising suspicion. But some deeper instinct kept him walking, kept his eyes moving over every face he passed, searching without quite admitting to himself what he hoped to find. He turned a corner onto a quieter side street, lined with small cottages set behind low garden walls, and stopped entirely. There, perhaps 30 paces ahead, a woman stood at a garden gate. A small child balanced on her hip, bundled against the cold in a knitted cap far too large for his tiny head. The woman's back was turned, her attention fixed on the boy as she pointed towards something in the darkening sky, and Julian could not see her face. But something in the set of her shoulders, the particular way she tilted her head when she spoke, sent a jolt through him so powerful he nearly stopped breathing entirely. He knew that posture. He had watched it across 1,000 dinner tables, in 1,000 quiet moments before everything between them had gone cold. He took a step forward, and then another, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, and the woman, perhaps sensing movement, began to turn. "Your Grace," Croft's voice, low and urgent, came from just behind him, and a firm hand closed around his arm before he could take another step. "Your Grace, wait, look, there, by the church, that man watching the street. I recognize him. He works for your aunt's household, or did until recently." Julian's attention snapped away from the woman at the gate, following Croft's gaze to a figure lingering near the churchyard wall, a thin man in a dark coat who was, Julian now realized, watching the same street with far too much interest for an idle passerby. "Impossible," Julian said. "I dismissed her entire staff when she left Renfield. Apparently not entirely thoroughly, Your Grace. I would wager a considerable sum that man is here on your aunt's business, not yours." Croft's grip on his arm tightened. "If she has learned we traced the settlement to Ashbrook, and sent someone ahead to watch for exactly this, then approaching Mrs. Hart directly, tonight, in the open street, could expose her to whatever scheme your aunt intends. We must be careful, Your Grace, for her sake as much as your own." Julian looked back toward the garden gate, but the woman had already turned fully now, gathering the child closer against the cold, and in the fading light he could not be entirely certain, could not swear with absolute conviction that it had been Eleanor at all. The moment stretched, agonizing, and then the woman turned and disappeared through the cottage door, the small boy's laughter drifting faintly behind her, before the door closed and the street fell quiet once more. "We will return in the morning," Croft said firmly, pulling Julian back toward the main street before his aunt's man could take note of them lingering. "Properly, carefully, and without drawing that man's attention to whatever household Mrs. Hart has settled into. I will make inquiries at the solicitor's office at first light and learn precisely who resides in that cottage, before either of us risks approaching." Julian allowed himself to be led away, though every instinct in his body screamed to turn back, to walk straight to that garden gate and demand answers immediately, consequences be damned. But Croft was right, and he knew it even through the desperate ache in his chest. If his aunt had indeed sent someone ahead, some careless move on his part could put Eleanor and, if the child at her hip truly was who he feared and hoped it might be, could put an innocent child at risk as well. The child. He had seen only a small bundled shape, a knitted cap, the barest impression of a round little face turned up toward the darkening sky. But something about the sight of that woman, that posture so achingly familiar, with a child on her hip, had lodged itself deep in his chest and refused to let go. He barely slept that night, lying awake in the modest inn-room Croft had secured, turning the image over and over in his mind. 7 months since Eleanor left Renfield. If the timing aligned, if she had been carrying a child even then, without either of them knowing. He sat up sharply in the darkness, his heart hammering with a possibility so enormous he could barely allow himself to consider it fully. A son or a daughter, born of their marriage, raised in secret in this quiet little town while he remained ignorant, grieving a marriage he did not yet know had left behind something far more precious than either of them had realized at the time. By dawn he had convinced himself of nothing and everything all at once, and when Croft returned from his early inquiries at the solicitor's office, Julian was already dressed and waiting, pacing the small inn parlor with barely contained urgency. "Well?" Julian demanded before Croft had even fully closed the door behind him. The solicitor was reluctant to speak freely, Your Grace, as one might expect, but I found him more agreeable once I explained, in careful terms, the nature of my employer's concern. Croft removed his hat, his expression carefully composed, though Julian could see something flickering beneath the professional calm. "A Mrs. Eleanor Hart does indeed reside in Ashbrook, in the cottage you observed last evening, lodging with a widow named Agnes Pratt. She arrived some 7 months ago, presenting herself as a young widow. Julian's chest tightened almost painfully. And the child? Croft hesitated, and in that hesitation, Julian found his answer, before the words were even spoken. A son, Your Grace. Born some 5 months past, by the solicitor's account, though he was reluctant to confirm details beyond confirming the child's existence and approximate age. 5 months. Julian did the calculation instantly, his mind racing back through the months before Eleanor's departure, and felt the floor seem to tilt beneath him. It was possible, it was more than possible, it was very likely, that the child had been conceived before she ever signed those divorce papers, that Eleanor had walked out of Renfield already carrying his son, and had said nothing, had chosen instead to bear that burden entirely alone, rather than trap him in a marriage he had shown no interest in saving. She never told me, Julian said quietly, more to himself than to Croft. 7 months, and she never once tried to tell me. Perhaps, Your Grace, she believed you would not have wanted to know, given the circumstances of your parting. The words struck harder than Croft likely intended, and Julian sank into the nearest chair, his earlier urgency giving way to something heavier, something closer to grief mixed with a fierce, desperate hope. He had failed her so thoroughly, so completely, that she had not even trusted him with the knowledge of his own child. And yet she had kept him, had raised him in secret rather than ending the burden entirely, had chosen, against every reasonable resentment she might have held, to give their son life. I want to see them, Julian said, rising from the chair with new resolve. Today. Now. Whatever careful arrangements you think necessary, Croft, arrange them quickly, because I do not intend to spend another single hour in this town without speaking to my wife and meeting my son. Your Grace, there is one further matter. Croft's expression had turned grave. The man we saw last evening near the church. I made careful inquiries this morning, and I am afraid my suspicions were correct. He has been in Ashbrook for the better part of a week, asking questions at the market and the church about a woman matching Mrs. Hart's description. I believe your aunt learned of our progress before her departure from Renfield, and dispatched him to locate Mrs. Hart independently, likely intending to use whatever she learned to her own advantage before you could reconcile. Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides. To what end? What could she possibly hope to gain now, cast out from Renfield entirely? I do not know, Your Grace, but a woman as calculating as your aunt does not send a man to watch a rival's household without some purpose in mind. I would advise moving quickly, before whatever scheme she intends can be set fully into motion. Julian was already reaching for his coat. Whatever his aunt intended, whatever danger her lingering spite might pose to Eleanor, and the son he had not yet even properly known existed, he would not allow it to reach them unchallenged. He had spent 7 months learning, slowly and painfully, exactly how much his silence and inaction had cost him. He would not make that mistake again, not now, not when everything that mattered most in the world was within his reach at last. They walked quickly through the streets of Ashbrook, the morning air sharp and cold, the town beginning to stir with the ordinary business of a new day. Carts rolling toward the market, shopkeepers pulling back their shutters, none of them aware of the storm quietly gathering in their midst. Julian's pulse had not slowed since Croft's confirmation of the child, and with every step closer to the cottage, he felt the weight of 7 months pressing down on him. Guilt and hope tangled so tightly together he could no longer separate one from the other. They had nearly reached the turn onto the quiet side street, when a figure stepped out from the shadow of a narrow alley, blocking their path with the deliberate calm of a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment. It was the same thin man in the dark coat Julian had noticed near the churchyard the evening before. Your Grace, the man said, inclining his head with a mockery of proper respect. Forgive the intrusion. My mistress asked that I deliver a message, should you arrive in Ashbrook before she managed to reach you herself. Your mistress no longer has any claim on my attention, Julian said, his voice flat and cold. Step aside. She thought you might say as much. The man withdrew a folded letter from inside his coat, holding it out with an air of practiced patience. She asked me to say that whatever you believe you have found here, matters are rather more complicated than they appear. The child's parentage, for instance, may not be so simply confirmed as you have been led to assume. Julian's hand shot out and seized the front of the man's coat before Croft could intervene, hauling him half a step forward. Choose your next words with considerable care. I am only the messenger, Your Grace. The man did not flinch, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Lady Fenwick merely wished you to consider, before you act rashly and publicly acknowledge a child whose true father might yet be called into question, that a woman living alone and unprotected for 7 months might have formed any number of acquaintances in that time, She would hate to see you embarrass the family a second time over a claim that cannot withstand scrutiny." Julian released the man so abruptly he stumbled back against the alley wall, the folded letter fluttering to the cobblestones between them. "My aunt has spent 4 years poisoning every good thing in my life, with exactly this kind of careful, deniable cruelty," Julian said, his voice shaking now with barely controlled fury. "She will not succeed a second time. Tell her when next you see her that I intend to learn the truth for myself, directly from the only 2 people whose word I trust in this matter, and that no letter, no insinuation, and no scheme she constructs will alter what I already know in my own heart." He did not wait for a response, stepping past the man and continuing down the street with Croft close behind him, leaving the unread letter lying forgotten on the cold stones. Whatever his aunt hoped to plant in his mind, whatever seed of doubt she intended to grow between him and the truth, he refused to let it take root. Not after everything the missing letters and years of quiet manipulation had already cost him. "Take me to her," he said again, his voice steadier now, resolve burning away the last of his hesitation. "Now, Croft. Whatever it costs, whatever risk it carries, I am done waiting." The knock at the cottage door came sharp and sudden, and Eleanor nearly dropped the bowl of porridge she was preparing for Henry's morning meal. It was too early for Dr. Whitmore, and Agnes had already left for the market with her basket over her arm. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, lifted Henry onto her hip where he babbled contentedly, and reached for a strand of her loose hair, and crossed to the door with a wariness that had become second nature these past few weeks, ever since Dr. Whitmore's mention of a stranger asking questions in town. She opened the door, and the bottom seemed to drop entirely out of her world. Julian stood on her doorstep. He looked different than the man she remembered, thinner, the lines around his eyes deeper, his usually immaculate appearance rumpled from what was clearly days of hard travel. But his eyes, when they met hers, held none of the cold distance she had grown so accustomed to during their marriage. They held something raw and desperate instead, something that looked almost like fear. "Eleanor," he said, and her name and his voice, after so many months of silence, struck her like a physical blow. She could not speak. Her arms tightened instinctively around Henry, pulling him closer against her chest, and she watched Julian's gaze drop from her face to the child in her arms, watched his entire expression change as he took in the small round face, the dark hair, the unmistakable set of the jaw that mirrored his own so precisely it left no room for doubt or denial. "Is he mine?" Julian's voice cracked on the question, barely above a whisper. "Eleanor, please, tell me the truth." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing, torn between 7 months of carefully guarded independence and the overwhelming flood of emotion that came from simply seeing his face again, from hearing him ask a question she had never expected him to have the chance to ask at all. "His name is Henry," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "He was born 5 months ago. And, yes, Julian, he is yours." Julian's composure broke entirely. He pressed one hand to his mouth, his eyes bright with tears he made no attempt to hide, and for a long moment he simply looked at his son, this small stranger who carried his blood and his eyes and, Eleanor suspected, would one day carry his stubborn nature as well. "May I—" He stopped, seeming to gather himself. "May I come in? I have so much to say to you, and I would rather not say it standing in the cold with half of Ashbrook able to overhear." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before stepping back to let him pass. Some part of her still braced for cruelty, for the cold indifference that had defined so much of their marriage, even as another part of her, the part that had never quite stopped loving him no matter how hard she tried to bury it, ached simply at having him near again. He sat stiffly at her small kitchen table while she settled Henry into his basket by the fire, and when she finally sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling, Julian spoke before she could ask a single question of her own. "I found your letter," he said, "the one you wrote before you left. I found it 3 weeks ago, hidden in an old ledger, where my aunt had buried it along with 5 others you sent me during those first months after my mother died." His voice roughened with what sounded like genuine grief. "I never received a single one of them, Eleanor. I did not know you tried to reach me. I did not know you asked me to let you in, to trust you with my grief, instead of shutting you out of it. I have spent every day since finding that letter, wondering what might have changed between us, if I had only read it in time." Eleanor felt the breath leave her lungs entirely. Margaret hid my letters? For years, apparently. Bribing or perhaps simply commanding a member of the household staff to intercept anything she believed might strengthen our marriage rather than weaken it. I confronted her the moment I understood what she had done, and I sent her from Renfield entirely. She will not trouble either of us again. not from within my household. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, years of quiet hurt and confusion suddenly rearranging themselves around this single, devastating revelation. She had spent so long believing Julian simply did not care enough to respond, that her attempts at closeness had genuinely meant nothing to him, when in truth he had never even known she was reaching for him at all. "That does not excuse everything," she said finally, her voice tight with old pain that refused to simply dissolve at the news of his aunt's cruelty. "You still shut me out long before those letters ever went missing, Julian. You still let me sign those papers without a single word of protest, without ever once asking me to stay." "I know." He reached across the table, not quite touching her, his hand hovering close enough that she could feel the warmth of it, without either of them closing the final distance. "I know, and I have no excuse for it, beyond my own cowardice. I was so consumed by grief after my mother's death that I convinced myself pushing everyone away, even you, was the only way to survive it. I did not understand, until you were already gone, that survival was never meant to be something I did alone. That you had offered, again and again, to carry that grief alongside me, and I refused every single time because I did not believe I deserved comfort I had not earned." Eleanor felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, 7 months of carefully controlled composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of everything he was saying. "I signed those papers because I could not spend one more year loving a husband who looked through me as though I were not even in the room," she said. "I did not tell you about Henry, because I refused to trap you into staying out of duty, when I wanted, more than anything, for you to stay because you chose me freely." "I am choosing you now," Julian said, his voice fierce with a conviction she had not heard from him in years, not since the earliest days of their courtship, before grief had hollowed him out and left only silence in its place. "I know I have no right to ask for a second chance, not after everything I failed to do the first time. But I am asking regardless, Eleanor, because I cannot bear the thought of spending one more day without you and without our son, and because I believe, with everything left in me, that I can be the husband you always deserved, if you will only give me the chance to prove it." Before Eleanor could find words to answer, a sharp knock sounded at the cottage door, hard and urgent, and both of them turned as it swung open without waiting for an answer. The thin man in the dark coat stood on the threshold, his earlier calm entirely abandoned, replaced by something closer to panic. Behind him, in the narrow street beyond the garden gate, Eleanor could see a carriage she recognized instantly, the Fenwick crest emblazoned on its door despite everything Julian had told her about his aunt's dismissal from Renfield. "Forgive the intrusion," the man said breathlessly, "but Lady Fenwick insisted I bring her directly." She would not be dissuaded. Margaret Fenwick swept past him into the small cottage as though she owned it, her dark eyes moving swiftly over the modest room, over Julian seated at the table, over the basket by the fire where Henry had begun to fuss at the sudden commotion, and finally settling on Eleanor with an expression of cold, calculating triumph. "How touching," Margaret said. "A tearful reunion. I do apologize for interrupting such a tender scene, but I felt it my duty to ensure my nephew was in full possession of the facts before he did something rash, such as publicly acknowledging a child whose parentage remains, at the very least, questionable." "Get out of this house," Julian said, rising from his chair with a fury Eleanor had never once seen from him during their entire marriage. "I told you at Renfield you were no longer welcome anywhere near my family, and I meant it absolutely." "Your family?" Margaret's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Julian, dearest, look at her. A woman abandoned to fend for herself for 7 months, in a strange town, with no husband and no protection. Do you truly believe no other man crossed her path in all that time? The child's coloring proves nothing definitive. Dark hair and blue eyes are hardly uncommon traits." "How dare you?" Eleanor said, rising as well. Henry's fussing growing louder as he sensed the tension filling the small room. She crossed to lift him from the basket, holding him protectively against her chest, and turned to face Margaret directly, years of quiet endurance finally giving way to open, righteous fury. "I have never once been unfaithful to your nephew, not in 4 years of marriage, and not in the 7 months since I left him. You know that perfectly well. You are simply desperate, now that your schemes have been exposed, to plant whatever doubt you can, before he learns the full truth of what you have done." "I have done nothing but protect this family from people unworthy of its name," Margaret said, though her composure had begun visibly to crack under the weight of both their combined fury. "You hid my letters," Eleanor said, "for years. You let your own nephew believe I had abandoned him without ever once trying to reach him, when in truth I begged him, again and again, to let me help carry his grief. You built a wall between us out of nothing but your own cruelty and pride, and you are still standing here, in my home, trying to build another one now that the first has finally come down." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Julian stepped forward, placing himself firmly between his aunt and his family, his expression harder than Eleanor had ever seen it. "You will leave this house immediately," he said, "and you will not approach either of them again, not with letters, not with hired watchers, not with a single word spoken against their character to anyone in this town or beyond it. If you attempt it, I will ensure the entire truth of what you did with those letters becomes known to every family of consequence in England, and you may explain your own conduct to whatever society still receives you afterward." For a long moment, Margaret Fenwick stood frozen, her carefully constructed composure finally, entirely stripped away, revealing beneath it something smaller and more bitter than either of them had ever fully seen before. Then, without another word, she turned and swept from the cottage, her thin messenger scrambling to follow, and moments later the sound of carriage wheels receded down the quiet street, carrying her away from Ashbrook and, Eleanor hoped fervently, out of their lives entirely. The cottage fell silent except for Henry's quieting whimpers, and Eleanor found herself trembling, adrenaline and relief and lingering fury all tangled together in her chest. Julian turned back to her slowly, his expression softening from fury into something far more tender, and reached out, this time without hesitation, to gently touch Henry's small hand where it rested against Eleanor's shoulder. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for all of it. For every year I let my grief build walls between us. For every letter I never received because I was too consumed by my own pain to notice you reaching for me. For letting you walk out of that solicitor's office without a single word to stop you, when everything in me was screaming to ask you to stay." His voice broke slightly. "I do not deserve a second chance, Eleanor, but I am asking for one regardless, because I love you, and because I have spent 7 months learning exactly how much that love costs when I fail to fight for it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the raw honesty in his face, so different from the careful, guarded distance he had worn for so much of their marriage, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for months finally begin, slowly and cautiously, to loosen. "I am not the same woman who left Renfield 7 months ago," she said finally. "I have built a life here, Julian, a good life, with people who care for me, and a son I love more than anything in this world. If you want a place in that life, you will have to earn it. Not with grand gestures or titles or promises made in the heat of the moment, but slowly, honestly, the way you should have from the very beginning." "I understand," Julian said, and something in his voice told her he meant it entirely. "Whatever time it takes, whatever proof you require, I will give it. I only ask that you let me try." Eleanor looked down at Henry, who had settled against her shoulder, his small fist curled once more into her hair, and then back up at Julian, at the hope and fear tangled together in his eyes, and felt for the first time in 7 months, the smallest, most cautious flicker of something that might, given time and honesty and patience, grow once again into trust. "You may try," she said quietly. "But slowly, Julian, and honestly. No more silence between us, whatever comes." He nodded, and for the first time since arriving in Ashbrook, Julian Ashford allowed himself to smile, small and unguarded, and entirely genuine, as he reached out once more to gently touch his son's small hand, beginning, at long last, the slow and careful work of earning back everything he had once so carelessly let go. Agnes returned from the market perhaps an hour later, her basket laden with vegetables and gossip in equal measure, and stopped dead in the cottage doorway at the sight of the well-dressed stranger seated at her kitchen table, Henry now contentedly asleep in his arms while Eleanor busied herself preparing tea with hands that had only just steadied. "Well," Agnes said slowly, setting down her basket, her sharp eyes moving between Julian's fine traveling coat and Eleanor's flushed, uncertain expression. "I take it this is the father, then. About time he found his way here, if you don't mind my saying so." "Agnes," Eleanor said, torn between embarrassment and something close to laughter at the older woman's characteristic bluntness. "This is Julian. Julian, this is Agnes Pratt, who has been more family to me these past months than I ever thought to hope for." Julian rose carefully, mindful not to wake the sleeping child in his arms, and inclined his head with a genuine warmth that surprised even Eleanor. "Mrs. Pratt, I owe you a debt I do not think I can ever properly repay. Thank you for taking such good care of my wife and son when I failed to do so myself." Agnes studied him a long moment, the way she studied any stranger who wandered too close to someone she had grown protective of, and whatever she saw in his face seemed, gradually, to satisfy her. "See that you don't fail her again," she said simply. and we'll get along just fine. Your Grace or no your Grace." She turned toward the kitchen, already reaching for the kettle Eleanor had abandoned. "Sit, both of you. That babe will wake soon enough wanting his supper, and you've clearly a great deal more to discuss before this day is through." They stayed at the small kitchen table long into the evening, the three of them, talking in fits and starts as old wounds were carefully, tentatively examined, and old hopes cautiously revived. Julian spoke of Renfield, of his aunt's departure and the quiet emptiness the estate had fallen into in her absence, and Eleanor spoke, hesitantly at first and then with growing ease, of the life she had built in Ashbrook, of Dr. Whitmore's kindness, and Nora Fenn's friendship, and the strange, unexpected peace she had found in a town she had chosen for no reason beyond its distance from everything she once knew. When Julian finally rose to leave, promising to return the following morning and every morning after for as long as it took, he paused at the door and looked back at Eleanor, at Henry now stirring awake in her arms, and at the small, warm cottage that had become, in his absence, a whole world he knew nothing about. "I do not deserve this chance," he said quietly, "but I intend to spend every day proving myself worthy of it regardless." Eleanor said nothing, only watched him go, her heart caught somewhere between the old, familiar ache of loving him and a new, fragile hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Whatever came next, she knew now, would not be decided in a single tearful reunion, but in the slow, patient accumulation of honest days that followed it. And for the first time since signing those divorce papers 7 months earlier, she found herself willing to wait and see what those days might bring. The letter arrived on a bright morning in early spring, sealed with the Fenwick crest, and Eleanor's hands went cold the instant she recognized the wax stamp pressed into the folded paper. 6 months had passed since Margaret's carriage had disappeared down the quiet streets of Ashbrook. 6 months of Julian's steady, patient courtship. 6 months of slowly, carefully rebuilding something neither of them had believed possible only a year before. She had allowed herself, in that time, to hope that Margaret Fenwick had truly withdrawn from their lives for good. She should have known better. She carried the letter to the small writing desk Julian had given her for Christmas, set now beneath the window of the cottage that had become, gradually and without either of them quite planning it, something closer to a proper home, and broke the seal with trembling fingers. The words inside were fewer than she expected, and far more dangerous. Margaret had not written to threaten or to plead. She had written, in cold and careful language, to inform Eleanor that she intended to contest Henry's legitimacy before the full assembly of the Ashford family's closest connections at an event already planned for the following week, a gathering meant to celebrate the anniversary of Julian's late father's founding of a charitable trust that had, for generations, brought together the most influential families in the county. Margaret would be present, and she intended, the letter made clear, to raise the question of Henry's parentage publicly, before witnesses whose opinions carried enough weight to do lasting damage regardless of whatever proof Julian might later produce. Eleanor read the letter twice, her heart pounding, and then folded it carefully, and went to find Julian, who was in the small garden behind the cottage, kneeling in the dirt beside Henry as the boy, now nearly a year old and delighted with his own newfound ability to walk in short, wobbling bursts, chased after a wooden ball Julian had carved for him during the long winter evenings. "Julian." He looked up at her tone, immediately alert, and rose from the dirt with Henry scooped up against his hip in the same easy, practiced motion he had learned over months of steady presence. "What is it?" She handed him the letter without a word, and watched his expression darken as he read it, his jaw tightening with an anger she had rarely seen from him since that first devastating confrontation in this very cottage. "She will not stop," he said quietly, "even now. What will you do?" Julian was silent for a long moment, staring down at the letter, and when he finally looked up, Eleanor saw something new in his expression, a resolve that had been building, she realized, for the entirety of the past 6 months, quiet and patient beneath his steady courtship, waiting for exactly this kind of challenge to bring it fully into the light. "I will not hide from this," he said. "I will not let her force us into some quiet, private negotiation where she can twist the truth to her own advantage behind closed doors. If she wishes to raise this question publicly, then I will answer it publicly, before every single person she hoped to use against us." He handed the letter back to Eleanor, his free arm tightening protectively around Henry. "I want you there, Eleanor, beside me, if you are willing. I do not think I can properly finish what my aunt started without you standing at my side." Eleanor felt her heart clench, equal parts fear and fierce determination. "I am willing," she said, I have spent 7 months hiding from your family's judgment, Julian. I find I am rather tired of it. The gathering took place the following week at Renfield itself, in the great hall Eleanor had once walked through as a young bride, uncertain of her welcome even then, and had not set foot in since the day she signed her divorce papers and walked away. The hall was filled with the great families of the county, dressed in their finest, the air heavy with polite conversation and the particular kind of watchful curiosity that always surrounded a duke's affairs. Eleanor entered on Julian's arm. Henry held carefully in the arms of a nursemaid who followed a discreet distance behind them, and felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the whispers rise like a tide at her presence, at the sight of the young son she carried with her. Margaret Fenwick stood near the great fireplace, resplendent in dark green silk, her expression composed into perfect, cold serenity as she watched them enter. She had clearly expected Julian to arrive alone, or perhaps not at all, cowed into private negotiation rather than open confrontation, and something flickered across her face at the sight of Eleanor beside him, though she recovered her composure almost instantly. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice carrying easily across the hall as conversation gradually stilled around them, sensing the tension building beneath the polite surface. "How good of you to join us, and you have brought guests." Her gaze moved deliberately to the nursemaid and the child she carried. "Though I confess I am surprised at your boldness, given the questions still hanging unresolved over that child's parentage." The room fell entirely silent, every guest turning to watch, and Eleanor felt Julian's arm tighten beneath her hand, steady and certain despite the weight of dozens of curious stares. "There are no questions remaining unresolved, Aunt Margaret," Julian said, his voice clear and carrying, pitched deliberately for the entire hall to hear. "Only accusations you have manufactured out of your own bitterness, in a final attempt to salvage whatever influence you believe you still hold over this family." "I speak only out of concern for the Ashford name," Margaret said smoothly. "A woman abandoned for 7 months, alone in a strange town, and now suddenly presenting a child as your heir? Surely I am not the only person in this hall who finds the timing worthy of question." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, felt the old, familiar fear of judgment rise in her chest. But beside her, Julian did not waver. "Let me answer that question plainly then, before this entire assembly, so there can be no further doubt raised by anyone in this room." Julian's voice rang out steady and unshaking across the great hall. "My son Henry was conceived during my marriage to Eleanor, before she ever left Renfield, a fact I have confirmed through the careful accounting of dates that any physician in this room would readily corroborate given the child's age. Eleanor did not tell me of her condition when she left, not because she meant to deceive me, but because she refused to trap me into a marriage I had shown no willingness to fight for, choosing instead to raise our son entirely alone rather than force my hand." He paused, letting the words settle over the silent hall, and then continued, his voice roughening slightly with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "The fault in our separation lies entirely with me, and with my aunt, who I have since learned intercepted and hid 6 letters Eleanor wrote to me during the most difficult months of our marriage, letters begging me to let her help carry my grief, rather than shut her out of it. I never received a single one, because Margaret Fenwick decided, on my behalf, that my own wife's love was not worth my attention." He turned to face his aunt fully now, and the fury in his expression made even Margaret take an involuntary step backward. "You have spent years manipulating this family for your own sense of control, Margaret, and you very nearly succeeded in destroying everything that mattered most to me. I will not allow you to succeed now." Margaret's composure finally, visibly cracked under the weight of dozens of watching eyes, her carefully constructed narrative collapsing in real time before the very audience she had hoped to turn against Eleanor. "You would take her word, and a child's coloring, over the concerns of the family who raised you?" she said, her voice sharper now, edged with real desperation. "After everything I have done to protect this name?" "You have protected nothing but your own influence," Julian said, "and that ends today." He turned back to the hall, drawing Eleanor gently forward beside him, and lifted his voice once more so that every guest present could hear clearly. "I stand before all of you to formally and publicly acknowledge Henry Ashford as my son and rightful heir, born of my marriage to Eleanor Hart, a woman of far greater courage and integrity than I have ever managed to demonstrate myself. Whatever doubts my aunt has attempted to sow here today, I hope my own word, given openly before this entire assembly, will serve to settle them permanently." A long moment of silence followed, and then, slowly, one of the older guests near the front of the hall, a Countess Eleanor vaguely recognized from her earlier days as a duchess, stepped forward and inclined her head respectfully toward Eleanor. "Well said, Your Grace. the Countess said, her voice carrying clearly. I have always found accusations far less convincing than a man willing to stake his own reputation on the truth before witnesses. I, for one, am satisfied. Others followed, murmurs of agreement rippling through the hall, and Eleanor watched Margaret's face drain of color as she realized, in real time, that whatever influence she had once wielded over this family and this county had finally, completely, evaporated. Without another word, Margaret turned and swept from the hall, her earlier composure entirely abandoned, and did not look back. The tension in the room broke slowly, conversation gradually resuming, though now the whispers carried a different quality entirely, curiosity rather than judgment, and several guests approached in the following hour to offer their genuine congratulations, to admire Henry as the nursemaid brought him closer, to remark on how clearly he carried his father's eyes. It was nearly an hour later, as the gathering began to wind down and guests slowly took their leave, that Julian drew Eleanor aside into a quiet alcove near the great hall's tall windows. Henry now settled contentedly in her own arms, tired from the excitement of so many new faces. I have one more thing to say, Julian said, and something in his voice made Eleanor's heart begin to race. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Eleanor felt her breath catch entirely as he opened it to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, nothing like the grand, ostentatious jewelry that had once marked her as an Ashford duchess, but something clearly chosen with far greater care and thought. I know I already asked for a second chance 6 months ago, Julian said, his voice unsteady with genuine emotion, and I know you told me I would have to earn it slowly, honestly, and I have tried to do exactly that every single day since. I am not asking now because I believe I have fully earned it, Eleanor. I do not think a man could ever entirely earn back what I so carelessly let go. I am asking because I love you, because I have watched you build an entire life out of nothing but your own strength and courage, and because I cannot imagine spending whatever years remain to me without you and Henry beside me, not as duty, not as obligation, but because you are, both of you, everything I did not know I was missing until I very nearly lost you forever. Eleanor looked down at the ring, and then up at Julian's face, at the raw hope and fear tangled together in his expression, so different from the cold, distant man who had once let her walk out of a solicitor's office without a single word to stop her. She thought of the 7 months she had spent building a life entirely her own in Ashbrook, of Agnes's steady kindness, and Dr. Whitmore's quiet friendship, and the fierce, protective love she had carried for Henry every single day since his birth. She thought, too, of the 6 months since, of Julian's patient, unwavering presence, of every small promise kept and every honest conversation that had slowly, carefully rebuilt something she had once believed entirely broken beyond repair. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady and sure. Yes, Julian. I will marry you again. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and then pulled her carefully into an embrace, mindful of Henry still nestled between them, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since that cold morning in the solicitor's office nearly a year earlier, that she had finally, truly come home, not to Renfield's grand stone halls or its cold, watchful portraits, but to something far simpler and far more precious, a family built not on duty or obligation, but on hard-won honesty and a love that had, against every reasonable expectation, found its way back to itself. They were married again 6 weeks later, in the small stone chapel on the eastern edge of the Renfield estate, the very same chapel where Julian's mother lay buried beneath her modest, unassuming stone. Eleanor had insisted on a quiet ceremony, nothing like the grand, glittering affair that had marked their first wedding all those years ago, when she had been a nervous young bride entering a family that never quite made room for her. This time, only those who truly mattered gathered beneath the chapel's simple arched windows, Agnes Pratt seated proudly in the front pew in her finest gray dress, Dr. Whitmore beside her, Nora Fenn dabbing at happy tears throughout the entire brief ceremony. Henry, not yet old enough to understand the significance of the day, spent most of the service babbling contentedly in his nursemaid's arms, occasionally reaching out toward his parents with small, grasping hands, and more than once his delighted laughter rang out through the quiet chapel, at exactly the wrong solemn moment, drawing soft, affectionate laughter from the small gathered crowd in return. When Julian slid a second ring onto Eleanor's finger, this one a simple gold band to match the one already resting beside it, he leaned close and spoke words meant only for her, though she would later tell Agnes she suspected half the chapel had heard them regardless. I love you, he said, not out of duty, not out of guilt for everything I failed to do the first time, but simply because you are the finest, bravest woman I have ever known, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of standing beside you." Eleanor felt tears slip freely down her cheeks, and did not bother to hide them. "I love you too," she said, "and I forgive you, Julian. Not because you have fully earned it, but because I have watched you become, day after day, the man I always believed you could be, if only you let yourself try." They exchanged their vows beneath the chapel's quiet light, and when the small ceremony concluded, the modest gathering moved outside into the bright spring afternoon, where a simple celebration awaited beneath the estate's blossoming trees. Nothing like the formal, watchful gatherings that had once defined Eleanor's earlier life at Renfield, but warm and easy and filled with genuine laughter. Agnes found Eleanor alone for a quiet moment, near the edge of the gathering, watching Julian carry Henry on his shoulders across the lawn, the boy shrieking with delighted laughter at the unfamiliar height. "You look happy," Agnes said simply, settling beside her. "I am," Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it completely. "I never thought I would say that again, standing on this estate. I thought I had left happiness behind entirely when I walked out of here a year ago." "Sometimes you have to walk away from a thing entirely," Agnes said, "before either of you can learn what it's truly worth. You didn't come back because you needed him, Eleanor. You came back because you chose him, freely, with your eyes wide open this time. That's a very different thing than the marriage you left behind, and don't you forget it." Eleanor watched Julian set Henry gently back down on the grass, watched their son immediately toddle off in unsteady pursuit of a butterfly drifting lazily among the blossoms, and felt her chest fill with a quiet, settled contentment she had never quite managed to find during her first years at Renfield, when she had been so desperate to earn a love that always seemed to remain just out of reach. She did not need to earn it any longer. Julian had proven himself patiently, honestly, over the long months since that first devastating reunion in her small cottage, keeping every promise he made, showing up faithfully every single day, whether the weather was fair or foul, whether Henry was in a joyful mood or a fussy one, whether Eleanor herself felt warm toward him, or still guarded by old hurts that took time to fully heal. He had earned his place beside her, not through grand gestures made once and then forgotten, but through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of 1,000 small, honest days. As the afternoon light began to soften into evening gold, Julian returned to her side. Henry once more balanced easily on his hip, and slipped his free hand into hers. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, echoing, perhaps without even realizing it, the same solicitor's office where everything between them had once seemed irreparably broken. Eleanor looked out at the estate's gardens, at the chapel where his mother rested, and where they had just renewed vows neither of them had ever truly expected to speak again. At the small gathered crowd of people who had become, over the strange and difficult course of the past year, something closer to a real family than the grand, cold portraits lining Renfield's halls had ever managed to be. "None," she said, and meant it entirely. "Only gratitude, that we found our way back to each other, in the end." Julian pressed a kiss to the top of Henry's dark head, and then, gently, to Eleanor's lips, and together the three of them walked back toward the celebration waiting beneath the blossoming trees, no longer a duchess reclaimed by duty and a duke redeemed by desperate regret, but simply a family, finally and fully whole, choosing each other freely, one honest day at a time. 3 years passed at Renfield, and the great stone house that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming to Eleanor slowly transformed into something entirely different, filled now with the sound of small running feet, with laughter echoing through corridors that had once known only careful, hushed voices. Henry had grown into a bright, curious boy of nearly 4, full of endless questions and a stubborn determination that reminded Eleanor, more with every passing year, of the father he so closely resembled. He was not an only child for long. A daughter arrived the following spring, born in the same grand bedchamber where Julian himself had been born, a small, fierce girl with her mother's warm brown eyes and her father's unmistakable dark hair, whom they named Margaret, not for the aunt who had caused them so much grief, but for Julian's own grandmother, a gentlewoman Eleanor had heard spoken of only in the fondest terms by the older tenants on the estate. Little Meg, as she quickly came to be called, grew up trailing after her older brother through the gardens and stables with a fearlessness that occasionally left the household staff holding their breath. Dr. Whitmore visited often in those years, making the long journey from Ashbrook whenever his practice allowed, delighted to watch the children he had helped bring safely into the world grow taller and bolder with each visit. Agnes came too, settled now in a small cottage on the Renfield estate itself, close enough to see her adopted family whenever she pleased. close enough that Henry and later Meg grew up calling her grandmother as naturally as if the title had always belonged to her. Nora Fenn wrote regularly, her letters full of news from Ashbrook, of her own growing family, of a town that had, in its own quiet way, played host to the beginning of a story none of its residents had fully understood at the time. Of Margaret Fenwick, little was heard. She had settled eventually in a distant corner of the country, her once considerable influence reduced to nothing more than faint, occasional gossip that reached Renfield only rarely, and Julian, true to his word, never allowed her name to be spoken with anything but careful, distant courtesy whenever it arose at all. Eleanor found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no lingering bitterness toward the woman who had once caused them so much needless suffering, only a distant kind of pity for someone who had spent so many years mistaking control for love, and had lost, in the end, everything she had tried so desperately to protect. Julian changed in those years as well, gradually and steadily, in ways both large and small. He learned to speak openly of his grief for his mother, no longer burying it beneath careful silence, but sharing it honestly with Eleanor in quiet evening conversations by the fire, and in doing so, found the weight of that old sorrow finally beginning to ease. He became known throughout the county not merely as a duke who managed his estate with careful competence, but as a father who could often be found on his knees in the garden dirt, building elaborate wooden forts with his son, or patiently teaching his daughter to identify birds by their song during long, unhurried walks through the estate's woodlands. He never stopped, in all those years, finding small ways to honor the woman who had once walked away from him with nothing but a single trunk and an unspoken secret, and returned only when he had finally proven himself worthy of the trust she had once given so freely, and lost through his own failures. Every year, on the anniversary of the day she had first arrived back at Renfield, he brought her fresh flowers cut from the same garden where they had first reconciled, a small, quiet tradition that meant more to Eleanor than any grand gesture ever could have. One evening, as the children slept soundly upstairs and the great house settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Eleanor sat with Julian in the small study that had once been the site of so much cold silence between them, now transformed into a warm, comfortable room, filled with the children's scattered toys and Eleanor's own growing collection of books. "Do you ever think of how differently things might have gone?" she asked, curled against his side as the fire crackled low in the hearth. "If Croft had never found that address, if you had never learned about the letters, if I had simply stayed hidden in Ashbrook forever." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his arm tightening gently around her shoulders. "I think of it often," he admitted. "I think of how close I came to losing everything that matters most to me, through nothing but my own cowardice and silence. I do not know that I could have survived losing you and Henry both, without ever even knowing he existed." He pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head. "I am grateful, every single day, that fate gave me a second chance I did not deserve, and that you were brave enough and generous enough to accept it." "We built this together," Eleanor said. "You more than earned it, Julian, over these years. I do not think I could have imagined, that cold morning in the solicitor's office, that we would ever find our way back to something this whole." Outside the study window, the estate lay quiet beneath a sky full of stars. The same gardens where Margaret Fenwick had once tried and failed to poison everything good between them now filled instead with the quiet echoes of children's laughter, and the steady, patient love that had grown there in her absence. Eleanor thought sometimes of the young woman who had signed those divorce papers with trembling hands, certain she was walking away from everything, and marveled at how far that same woman had traveled since, through grief and fear and hard-won independence, to arrive finally at this quiet, contented peace. She thought, too, of Ashbrook, of the small cottage where Henry had taken his first breath, where she had learned to stand entirely on her own 2 feet for the first time in her life, and felt a deep and lasting gratitude for that difficult, formative year, even as she treasured everything that had grown from it since. It had taught her, in ways nothing else could have, exactly what she was capable of when she trusted no one but herself, and that hard-won knowledge had made her a stronger wife, a stronger mother, and a stronger woman than she might otherwise have ever become. As the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, Julian rose and extended his hand toward her, drawing her up from the chair with the same gentle patience that had come to define every year of their renewed marriage. "Come," he said softly. "Let us go check on the children before we retire. Henry has been talking all week about the pony he insists he is ready to ride, and I suspect he means to argue the point again the moment he wakes." Eleanor laughed, the sound warm and easy in the quiet room, and took his offered hand. "He gets that stubbornness from you, you know." "I rather think," Julian said, guiding her toward the door with a smile that held none of the cold distance of the man she had once left behind. He gets it from both of us in equal measure." They climbed the wide staircase together, past the same portraits of Ashford ancestors that had once seemed so forbidding to Eleanor, and paused at the door of Henry's nursery, where their son slept soundly, one small hand curled beneath his cheek, and then at Meg's, where their daughter lay tangled peacefully in her blankets, a stray curl falling across her small, contented face. Eleanor stood in the doorway a long moment, watching her children sleep, feeling Julian's steady presence warm beside her, and understood, more fully than she ever had before, that every hardship of that difficult first year, every tear shed in that small Ashbrook cottage, every moment of fear and uncertainty, had led her exactly here, to this quiet hallway, this whole and healed family, this life built not on duty or obligation, but on honesty, patience, and a love strong enough to survive even its own worst failures. Just as Julian had predicted, Henry was awake and arguing his case before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills the following morning, tugging insistently at his father's sleeve while Eleanor dressed Meg for breakfast in the nursery down the hall. "You promised," Henry declared, planting his small hands on his hips in an unconsciously perfect imitation of his father's own posture during difficult estate negotiations. "You said when I turned 4 I could ride the pony properly, not just led about on a rope like a baby." Julian exchanged an amused glance with Eleanor over their son's head. "I did say that," he admitted, "though I recall specifying the West paddock, and only with your mother and me both present." "You are both present," Henry pointed out, with the flawless logic of a child who had clearly been waiting all week to deploy this exact argument. "Right now." Eleanor laughed despite herself, setting Meg down to toddle after her brother, who had already darted toward the stairs with the singular focus only a 4-year-old pursuing a long-anticipated promise could summon. "He has your gift for finding the loophole in any agreement," she said to Julian, following after their children with an indulgent shake of her head. "I begin to fear what he will be like at 10. "Formidable, I imagine," Julian said, catching her hand as they walked. "Rather like his mother." The West paddock lay golden in the early morning light when they arrived, the estate's small, patient gray pony already saddled and waiting under the watchful eye of the head groom, a weathered man named Elias who had served the Ashford stables for nearly 30 years and had grown genuinely fond of the children who now filled the estate with noise and life after so many quiet decades. Henry could barely contain himself as Elias lifted him carefully into the small saddle, his face alight with the particular fierce joy of a child achieving something he had wanted desperately for what felt, to him, like an eternity. "Hold the reins just as we practiced," Julian said, walking alongside the pony with one steady hand resting near his son's leg, ready to catch him at the first sign of trouble. "Gently now. She'll follow your lead if you stay calm." Henry nodded with the utmost seriousness, his small brow furrowed in concentration, and Eleanor stood at the paddock fence with Meg balanced on her hip, watching her son take his first wobbling, triumphant circuit of the paddock under his father's careful guidance. She felt her throat tighten with an emotion too full and complicated to name simply as happiness, though happiness was certainly a part of it, mixed with something closer to wonder at how completely this life had transformed from the frightened, uncertain days of her arrival in Ashbrook. "Look, Mama," Henry called out, his voice bright with pride as the pony carried him past the fence where she stood. "I'm doing it myself." "I see you," Eleanor called back, laughing through the sudden sting of happy tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "You're doing wonderfully, my love." Meg squirmed in her arms, reaching her small hands toward her brother and the pony with unmistakable determination, already impatient for her own turn at an achievement still several years distant, and Eleanor pressed a kiss to her daughter's dark curls, murmuring softly that her turn would come soon enough, that there was no need to rush toward anything when the present moment held so much worth savoring on its own. By the time the morning's excitement finally wound down and Elias led the pony back toward the stables for its own well-earned rest, Henry was flushed and grinning and utterly triumphant, chattering without pause about every detail of his ride to anyone who would listen, and Julian scooped him up onto his shoulders for the walk back toward the house, both of them laughing at some private joke only fathers and sons seemed to share. Eleanor walked beside them with Meg still balanced on her hip, watching the easy affection between Julian and their son, the patient warmth he had built so steadily over the years since that first devastating reunion in her small Ashbrook cottage, and felt, once again, the same deep and settled gratitude that had become such a constant companion in her life these past years. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever future chapters remained unwritten for the Ashford family, Eleanor faced them now without fear, secure in the knowledge that she and Julian had already weathered the very worst that circumstance and cruelty could throw against them, and had emerged, in the end, not merely intact, but stronger and truer for having survived it together.